What's going on, everybody? This is Zach with Strictly Shisha. Today I want to talk about a new contender in the coal market. And these things have been getting a lot of attention and a lot of hype. And I want to talk to you guys about my experience with them so far. So, these coals are SuperiorCoco coals. And the premise behind making these coals was that all tobacco is not created equal. All tobacco doesn't perform the same. So why are all coals pretty much the same today? They all go for the same standards, the same expectations. Superior wanted to create something different. They wanted to address some of these shortfalls in other brands and bring some innovation to the already saturated coal market. Now, one of the things they addressed was the batch inconsistencies that's common now with other brands. Now, the first thing he mentioned is these batch inconsistencies are not the fault of other brands. It's the situation that they're put in with the manufacturers that are mostly in Indonesia and their financial constraints and their inability to quality control the coals up to our standards. So one of the first things I noticed when speaking to the owner of SuperiorCoco, he's a very humble guy and he shows a lot of respect to other brands, and he just made it very clear to me that it's not their fault that these coals are not up to your standards. They just can't control what's happening all the way in Indonesia. So one of the coolest things about the Superior brand, they actually own their own factory in India. And I guess his family has a long history in the coal business, specifically in barbecue charcoal. So they know a lot about charcoal in general. And also his family lives there to keep an eye on the production. They can better quality control the coals, and they can make sure the product is released to our standards. Now, the one thing that he also mentioned is that sometimes the raw materials that are in places like Indonesia, they don't have the ability to store them, keep them away from moisture. They can't afford to hold the production back to dry out those raw materials and to produce a better product. So when you hear about coals from Indonesia and it's monsoon season and the raw material is wet, so that's why the coals weren't that great. His argument to that is if you hold the material back, you dry it properly, you store it in warehouses, you can fully combat the issue of batch inconsistencies. Also, another thing that's convenient about being in the charcoal business, for example, back in October, I believe he was going to release a batch of SuperiorCoco coals, and he wasn't happy with them. He wasn't happy with the performance and the quality, so he was able to totally scrap the batch. They were able to recycle them and sell them as barbecue charcoal and reproduce them. Now, companies in Indonesia can't do that. A lot of families are dependent on selling that batch of coals to the manufacturers and survive off that batch. So they are a little bit shady when it comes to things like that because of the financial constraints. They have to package those coals even though they're not perfect. The manufacturers never know that they're not perfect and they go out to market. So that was his whole point about batch inconsistencies with other brands. He said these major brands don't know and they're not trying to fool you. But he says he has a way of combating those issues and making sure that each batch is up to your standards. Now let's jump into my experience with using these SuperiorCoco coals. After hearing his explanation behind the design behind these coals, after hearing a lot of people's experience with these coals, I was like, man, these are gonna be a great product and I'm really excited to use them. I saw a lot of other reviews, other YouTubers saying these were amazing coals, some of the best on the market. So I got my batch a little later than most, but I was excited to try them out. So let's talk about that. The first thing I noticed when opening up this 1 kilo box of cubes, they weren't really as consistent as advertised. A lot of people said they were perfect cubes, comparing them to Coco Earth, how they're exactly 25 millimeters per se. I didn't measure them, but I noticed that some of them were off shape. Some of them were rhombuses, some of them were cubes. Now typically, I don't care what shape they are. The inconsistency in the cut does not bother me. I've seen some crazy looking coals. They don't bother me at all. The only ones that really bother me is when they're kind of stuck together, 2 cubes. Those are annoying, but if they're a little off center, I really don't care. But a lot of people made a big deal to point out that Superiors are much more consistent compared to other coals, but I think the hype created around these coals is really hurting them because it's setting the bar really high. So in terms of cut, these things are not perfect by any means. When I put them on the burner, I lit them up. They do light a little faster than most coals, but not noticeably any different. What I did notice though, the smell on the burner was one of the criteria that I really judge coals by. These do smell quite heavily on the burner. Thankfully, I light my coals outside these days, so I don't really care about that. But if you guys do light your coals inside, these will create a strong stench that might be off-putting to most. So these do smell on the burner. But like I said, doesn't really bother me. Immediately when I take the coals off the burner, in all of my testing, I notice there's already a layer of ash that's forming on the coals. The ash does stick to the coal, but there's already ash right when you remove it from the burner. So let's jump into the main reason why I don't prefer using SuperiorCoco coals. The ash on these things is incredible. It's a lot of ash. Now I hear that's by design. One of the differences between these coals and other coals is there's intentionally a layer of ash that forms on the outside of the coal, and the owner of SuperiorCoco says this is a way of heat managing and controlling the output of coals. He said with other coals, you put it on there and it produces as much heat as it can. With these, you can actually alter the amount of heat that it's producing by actually ashing the coals and creating more heat. The way he explained this to me was comparing it to smoking a cigar. If you are a cigar smoker, you can probably relate to this. I don't really smoke cigars. But he said when you smoke a cigar and you let the ash form at the end, it creates a more mild inhale because there's less heat. But when you want that stronger inhale, that warmer inhale, you actually ash the cigar. Similar with these coals, when you want a warmer session, you ash the coal and it produces more heat. When you want a more mild session for those heat sensitive tobaccos, you can actually allow that layer of ash to form on the outside. Now that's actually pretty cool. I've noticed with bowls, especially when using smaller bowls like the 80 feet, like the fudge bowl, typically 3 cubes of other brands is way too much heat and 2 coals is not enough. What's really cool about these SuperiorCoco coals, I could use 3 cubes on a smaller bowl and control the amount of heat without using a heat management device or foil or wind cover. It almost has that built-in heat management aspect. So for smaller bowls and when you have heat sensitive tobacco, these SuperiorCoco coals really shine because of that layer of ash on the outside. Now I'm accustomed to the heat output on other coals, so I've learned to pack differently and heat management better with higher heat coals on smaller bowls. So I've learned ways around normal coals that you can't heat manage, but it is cool. I've noticed with these coals, I love being able to use 3 large cubes on a smaller bowl and actually have an enjoyable session and not have to play with them as much. So that is really cool. But in pretty much every other situation, like with a heat management device like I'm using today, or if you're using them straight on foil with a larger bowl, the ash content is just way too much for my liking. You guys can see pictures here. Before even ashing in the Lotus, I smoked it for about 30 minutes. You can see the amount of ash that collected in the Lotus. That did translate to the session. When I removed the Lotus to clean it off, you could see a layer of ash that was in the tobacco themselves. I don't notice that with every other coal because there's not that much ash. When I was ashing these on a normal foil bowl, there was just ash everywhere. My tray had a layer of ash. There was ash on the table. You guys know I am messy. I don't like ash. I gave Prestige Coco coals not the perfect review because they had a lot of ash. So these create even more ash than Prestige Coco coals. These probably create as much ash as a wood charcoal. So I don't like the ash content on these at all. But like I said, in some aspects, that heat management ability with the coals and the ash is pretty cool. Now let's get into the reason why SuperiorCoco coals have more ash than other coals on the market, other than the heat management aspect of these coals. So the owner of SuperiorCoco says that other manufacturers introduce their coals to an acid wash process that helps reduce the volatile matter of the coals, thus reducing the ash later on. So his reasoning behind not doing this was, sometimes with that acid washing process, it does leave a chemical residue on the coals that's unnatural. He wants to keep his coals 100% natural. Even the binder that he uses in these coals is an organic starch. So his premise behind keeping these coals 100% natural and obviously a lot more healthy for you. But yes, it does create more ash. So I kind of compare this ideology to eating a watermelon. Do you prefer the healthier non-GMO watermelon, or do you want the simplicity of having that seedless watermelon? That's how I see these coals. Do you want something that has less ash, that's less healthy for you, but more convenient, or something that has more ash that is better for you? Same thing with deodorant. Do you want that natural deodorant where you stink, or that deodorant that might create cancer? I don't know, that's kind of up to you guys. I prefer the deodorant where I don't stink and I don't really like seeds. So I prefer the product that's more convenient, but I do see the reason why he wanted a chemical-free product, and I think that will appeal to a lot of people on the market that want a healthier coal choice. So using these coals because they might be healthier for you might be a reason why you guys like these coals. let's jump into the heat aspect of these coals. Now, with the ash layer, it does insulate the heat and they are less warm than comparable coals on the market. So I found these things to be pretty low heat output, much lower than titanium cubes, much lower than cocoa earth cubes, most lower than most cubes on the market that I've used. So I think the heat output on these are pretty low compared to what I like. I like to smoke a warmer bowl, and to be able to achieve that, I find myself ashing them a lot more to get that heat output. Thus in turn, the more you ash them, the more it reduces the longevity of the coals. So I actually found the longevity of these coals to be lower than I prefer and lower to comparable coals on the market. So if you were not to ash them, you like the lower heat session, you'd get a lot longer longevity, but because I ash them so much, they actually last a lot shorter than other coals on the market. So overall, the longevity on these is not really my preference because I need that higher output and these don't provide them without ashing. The ash output on these is way too high for my liking. They do not perform as I would like in the Lotus. They do not perform on a normal foil bowl. But where I see these things shining is with heat sensitive bowls. If you're smoking Tangiers, these things are wonderful for Tangiers. If you're smoking with smaller bowls, these things really perform well and they shine in circumstances like that. But for everyday use, I don't prefer them. They're a lot more work than I'd like. I always find myself having to ash them and play with them. I like to set it and forget it and smoke for an hour at least without worrying about coals. With these, every 20 minutes I'm having to ash them. By the way, the size-wise, you will not fit 3 cubes in the Lotus. Kind of a not big deal with other coals if they're really big and you don't fit them with the Lotus because the heat output is so high. With these, the heat output is much lower, so they don't fit in the Lotus. I have to ash them and finally fit them in there, so I don't prefer using these coals. But now for the price, right now, they are selling for $3.99 for a kilo. I'd say go buy them. Try them out for yourself and let me know what you think. But for full price, I probably would not recommend these coals. And that might be different from what a lot of other people are saying. A lot of people are really liking them. So maybe I'm just different. Maybe my preferences are different. Maybe my experience has been different. But I think the fact that I have to play with them so much, I have to ash them so much, they create a mess. They're a lot more work. They're just not my preference. But they are different. They do stand on their own 2 feet. They do not encroach on other coals. They do bring something different to the market. But check them out while they're on sale. They are $3.99 at 5-Star Hookah. They are $3.99 at Hookah Junkie. It's probably a limited introductory offer to the brand, so check it out while it's on sale. And please comment below with what you think. It's kind of weird when I think differently than a lot of other people. I want to make sure I'm on the same page as you guys, so let me know what you think. But thank you as always. I appreciate you guys and have a wonderful day. Bye everyone.